August 21, 1942. Tenarú River, Guadalcanal. The oppressive humidity of the jungle hung heavy, suffocating any sound that wasn't the wet slap of boots in the mud or the rapid-fire bzzzt of a million insects. 4 Lieutenant Kenjiro Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army, commanding a small, 3-man tank crew, the night was a coil of pure tension. They were part of Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's determined but disastrous counterattack against the American perimeter on Guadalcanal. Kenjiro was perched in the commander's cupola of his Type 95 Hago light tank, the engine ticking over quietly, waiting for the signal to advance. The Type 95 was Japan's most numerous tank, a 7.4-ton machine built for infantry support and speed, mounting a 37mm cannon. It was a marvel of Japanese ingenuity for its Tamiya machine designed to fight and win against the static defenses of China. But here, on this remote Pacific island, surrounded by a jungle that swallowed sound and light, Kenjiro knew its limitations. The armor was thin, easily defeated by anything heavier than a heavy machine gun. He could feel the eyes of his driver, Private Soto, peering through the narrow vision slot, sweat dripping onto the control levers. Suddenly, the night exploded. Traces zipped overhead, followed by the deafening thump-thump-thump of American heavy machine guns, likely the water-cooled Browning M2.50 caliber. Kenjiro ordered the advance. The Hago lurched forward, its engine a straining, high-pitched whine that was immediately dwarfed by the noise of battle. Kenjiro's 37mm gun fired in quick, measured bursts, trying to suppress the flashes of enemy fire. As the column pushed through the narrow clearing, they encountered the first true armored resistance. It wasn't a tank, but a dug-in American position reinforced with sandbags and barbed wire. Then, a massive, blocky shape emerged through the flickering muzzle flashes, an American M3 Stuart light tank. The Stuart, while technically a light tank, was heavier, better armored, and mounted the same 37mm gun. Kenjiro ordered his gunner, Corporal Honda, to fire. The armor-piercing round struck the Stuart's flank with a sharp clang. The projectile deflected, throwing a shower of bright sparks but failing to penetrate. Before Honda could reload, the Stuart responded. A heavy crush of metal followed, and the entire interior of Kenjiro's Hago was filled with the acrid, metallic smell of high explosive. Kenjiro felt a searing pain in his arm and was thrown against the turret wall. The tank shuddered violently, losing all power, the radio operator screaming in the darkness. Kenjiro, scrambling out of the damaged machine, realized his entire crew was incapacitated. As he crawled away, he looked back at his beautiful, defeated Type 95, rendered useless by a tank that, to the Japanese, represented the peak of American armored capability. What he didn't yet know was that the Stuart was already considered obsolete by the American forces. The true measure of American industrial power had not even begun to enter the battle yet. The logic of Japanese production versus American scale. Kenjiro, scrambling out of the damaged machine, realized his entire crew was incapacitated. As he crawled away, he looked back at his beautiful, defeated Type 95, rendered useless by a tank that, to the Japanese, represented the peak of American armored capability. What he didn't yet know was that the Stuart was already considered obsolete by the American forces. The true measure of American industrial power had not even begun to enter the battle yet. The small, relatively lightweight Type 95 Hago was not a failure of Japanese engineering, it was a success of Japanese philosophy. Imperial Japan, constrained by limited access to raw materials like iron ore and oil, and geographically separated islands, approached tank production with a focus on quality over sheer quantity and design geared toward their specific operational theaters, primarily the jungles and rice paddies of Asia. Their strategy prioritized infantry support and reconnaissance over head-to-head armored combat against Western powers. Factories like the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries facility in Tokyo produced the Type 95 with painstaking attention to detail, but at a glacial pace compared to the coming storm. In 1941, the year America entered the war, Japan produced a mere 228 tanks of all types. This production schedule was deemed adequate by the Imperial General Headquarters, which never fully grasped the necessity of fully mechanized divisions, viewing the tank primarily as a specialized infantry support weapon. They believed the spirit of the Bushido Code and the ferocity of the Japanese soldier would compensate for any material disparity. Meanwhile, 9,000 miles away, across the Pacific, the United States was transitioning its colossal, peacetime automobile industry into a war machine of unprecedented scale. The philosophy was simple: quantity is a quality all its own. The US understood that the war would be won not just by superior design, but by overwhelming logistical and material superiority, their ability to replace losses instantly and deploy resources that choked the enemy. The blueprint for this scale was the medium tank M4, soon to be universally known as the Sherman. Unlike the small, highly specialized factories of Japan, American giants like Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors were converting their massive assembly lines previously dedicated to producing millions of passenger car build war machines. The American approach was not to build the absolute best tank, but the fastest to build and the easiest to repair tank. It was a philosophy built on interchangeable parts, standardized components, and continuous rolling production. While Kengyo and his comrades suffer the loss of a valuable cargo in the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal, in the dry, sprawling yards of Detroit and Lima, Ohio, the first true fruits of this industrial mobilization were already being harvested. By the end of 1942, the year of Kengyo's capture, the U.S. had produced over 6,000 tanks of various types, including the first 1,000 Shermans. This sheer numerical advantage, however, remained an unseen, almost abstract threat to the Japanese command, whose reporting was consistently diluted by propaganda and denial. They were still fighting the War of 1937, unaware of the industrial avalanche about to engulf them. The debut of the Sherman and the Pacific Shock. They were still fighting the War of 1937, unaware of the industrial avalanche about to engulf them. For the soldiers fighting on the isolated islands of the Central Pacific, the concept of industrial avalanche soon became terrifyingly real. Following the brutal fighting on Guadalcanal, the next major Japanese resistance came on the Tarawa Atoll in November 1943. Sergeant Major Tetsuo Ishida, a veteran machine gunner who had survived the siege of Rabaul, was part of the garrison dug deep into the coral defenses of Bishio Island. His understanding of the Allied capability was based on small destroyers and poorly armed amphibian craft the Americans, he believed, were limited in how much heavy equipment they could bring ashore. The ferocious naval bombardment, however, was immediately followed by something Tetsuo had never witnessed: massive landing ship tanks, LSDs, disgorging machines that seemed colossal compared to the Japanese armored presence. The first M4 Sherman tanks rolled onto the blood-soaked sand of Bishio, their massive 75mm cannons traversing slowly, methodically searching for targets. For Tetsuo, seeing the Sherman in action was a visceral, terrifying confirmation of the enemy's material might. These machines were fast, heavily armored, and, most importantly, they seemed to be everywhere. His light Type 92 machine gun was utterly useless against the thick, sloped frontal armor. The Sherman's high-explosive rounds ripped through the coconut log bunkers and coral strongpoints with ease, turning carefully constructed defenses into instant tombs. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese doctrine relied on the enemy's inevitable logistical failure, a belief that the supply chain would break before the Imperial will did. But the Shermans kept coming, wave after wave, their tracks chewing up the narrow beachhead. Tetsuo watched a single Sherman systematically dismantle 3 separate pillboxes his squad had spent weeks reinforcing. The tank took a direct hit from a Japanese 70mm battalion gunner weapon designed to destroy light army and barely shuddered, the shell simply clanging off the glacis plate. This wasn't just a superior tank, it was a symbol of infinite replacement. The Japanese military had to husband every piece of equipment, treating a tank loss as a grave failure. The Americans, conversely, seemed to treat the Shermans as disposable tools, trading them for territory and victory. The sight of destroyed Shermans being pushed aside by new ones, rolling off the LSDs with seemingly endless backups, planted the first seed of systemic doubt in the Japanese fighting man. They were not fighting men, they were fighting a factory. The reports filtering back to the Imperial General Headquarters following Tarawa and subsequent island battles became increasingly alarming. They detailed the unprecedented numbers and unbelievable speed of repair of the American tanks. The disparity was no longer just a theoretical problem, it was the active, crushing force defining the Pacific battlefield. The shocking production figures and the post-war. The disparity was no longer just a theoretical problem, it was the active, crushing force defining the Pacific battlefield. The true, mind-numbing scale of this disparity remained obscured from the average Japanese soldier and even high command until the war's conclusion. During the conflict, estimates of American production were treated with skepticism, often dismissed as enemy propaganda designed to demoralize troops. It was only in the immediate aftermath of the surrender, when Japanese military and industrial experts were granted access to official American statistics and production records, that the complete picture of their material defeat snapped into agonizing focus. Mr. Hiroshi Izawa, a senior engineer who had overseen tank production at the Segami Arsenal during the war, was one of the first Japanese experts authorized to review the records provided by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, in late 1945. He sat in a cold, temporary office, surrounded by stacks of meticulously organized American reports detailing production quotas and outputs. He was there to assess Japan's industrial weakness, but nothing prepared him for the numbers he saw regarding the M4 Sherman tank. He knew that the total production of all Japanese medium tanks for the entire war, including the Type 97 Kaiwa, was fewer than 3,000 units. He knew that Japan never managed to achieve a peak annual production of more than 1,000 tanks of all classes. Then, he looked at the US production figures for the Sherman alone. The numbers were catastrophic. In 1943, the single year when the Shermans began rolling onto Pacific beaches, the United States produced over 8,800 M4 tanks. In 1944, that figure exploded to over 11,000. By the time the war ended, American industry had delivered nearly 50,000 M4 Sherman tanks of all variants. Ozawa's hands trembled as he held the ledger. 50,000. This single class of vehicle, built over 4 years by the enemy, outnumbered Japan's total tank production for the entire war by a factor of nearly 20 to 1. He understood then that the Japanese soldiers on Tarawa and Iwo Jima hadn't just been fighting tanks. They had been fighting a relentless, continuous, and unceasing stream of steel manufactured by assembly lines operating at a pace no other nation could comprehend. The realization was profound. It wasn't that the Sherman was inherently superior to every other tank, later variants were undoubtedly powerful, but that it was good enough and produced in overwhelming numbers. The sheer volume allowed the Allies to absorb losses, commit resources to every theater, and flood the battlefield with armor, rendering the Japanese doctrine of carefully managed assets obsolete. For engineers like Ozawa and veterans like Lieutenant Tanaka, the ultimate defeat had been sealed not on the battlefield, but in the sprawling, efficient factories of Detroit and Lima before they even fired a shot. For engineers like Ozawa and veterans like Lieutenant Tanaka, the ultimate defeat had been sealed not on the battlefield, but in the sprawling, efficient factories of Detroit and Lima before they even fired a shot. The immediate post-war assessment confirmed what men like Hiroshi Ozawa discovered in the ledgers. The Japanese concept of total war was fundamentally flawed against a nation with America's industrial base. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisu, head of intelligence for the Imperial Japanese Army and later a key source for post-war analysis, frequently commented on the unfathomable gap in manufacturing capacity. This gap was measured not just in final products like the Sherman, but in the raw materials and the infrastructure supporting them. The conversion of massive civilian infrastructure into war production facilities was something Japan simply could not replicate. Consider the Detroit Tank Arsenal, a facility capable of producing hundreds of tanks per month, or the sheer scale of the steel production needed to feed the assembly lines. America could produce approximately 4 times the amount of steel Japan could at its peak, and this advantage was quickly channeled into ships, planes, and tanks. The Sherman became the perfect manifestation of this industrial mindset. It was a utilitarian design, constantly refined mid-production based on battle feedback, but always built with the primary goal of rapid, mass deployment. This allowed the US to not only deploy Shermans to the Pacific, but also to ship them by the thousands to the Soviets, the British, and the Free French forces. The Sherman wasn't just America's tank. It was the tank of the entire Allied war effort, a testament to the fact that American industry was fighting and winning the war in multiple theaters simultaneously. For former soldiers like Kenjiro Tanaka, who eventually returned to a defeated, rebuilt Japan, the memory of his small, vulnerable Type 95 Hago never faded. The realization that the single M3 Stuart that disabled his tank was merely a harbinger, a tiny fraction of the impending deluge of Shermans, provided a deep and permanent understanding of why the Imperial Army was overwhelmed. They had fought valiantly, fueled by spirit and commitment, but they were fundamentally crushed by a nation that turned automobiles into tanks and peacetime factories into instruments of total war. The shock of seeing those massive assembly lines, even in retrospect, demonstrated that Japan was not defeated by a tactical error or a single battle, but by a sheer, relentless arithmetic of production that was always in the enemy's favor.